So our last speaker obviously does not need much introduction from me. Bob Fenner has been involved in basically every aspect of this trade for the last 4 decades.
He's old.
And he was a former MACNA award winner as well. Today he's going to be talking about overview of ornamental aquaculture techniques, plans and development, a means of paying for your marine habit, and more. So let's welcome Bob.
Thank you.
Right. I'd like to, first of all, say, let's think about the word aquaculture. It's a fave. Aqua, of course, meaning water, but culture, for me, favorite working definition is patterns of learned behavior. And what my hope is, through this presentation and maybe a small discussion at the end, that you'll take away some learned behavior that you can apply. My original talk was going to be an overview of aquaculture in toto, but that topic, of course, is very large and has been covered by a few people this time, and I'm very happy to see is the central theme of next year's MACNA in Orlando. I hope to be there. I always like to say, if you folks would like to see this presentation again, I used to call them pitches, or the references that are cited, they can be found on a site some friends and I run on the internet. Internet, people have heard of that? Web media. So my understanding of aquaculture is born of an empirical background. I was lucky enough to save up as a kid and retire by the time I was 94, in 1994, and dedicate myself time-wise, what have you, and travel to getting around in this interest in ornamental aquatics, principally in aquaculture. And so as a consequence, I developed an empirical understanding, sort of like thermodynamics, which was developed by railroad engineers, not so much from science, but from observing and unfortunately seeing what doesn't work, as well as the few times that people's efforts did work. And I came to understand that the business of aquaculture could be divided into 2 basic fields of endeavor, business and, I put down aquarist, but husbandry. And I say this because there are many people, probably most of the folks in this room, who are capable, have the knowledge and skills to be successful husbands of aquaculture. But the real issue is that it's absolutely necessary to also have the knowledge and skills of a practical business person. And this is, from my standpoint, something I've seen over and over and over. People, of course, are able to pick out good stock. They can keep it alive. They can asexually or sexually reproduce it. But they don't know enough about business to make the business successful. And what's a success? Smiles per hour, reproduction, what have you. You want to be successful. Are there very many people in here that are erstwhile aquaculturists? Anybody who does aquaculture and pays their bills? There we go. It can be done. So hopefully there'll be enough time to get past just the business side discussion and a little bit of the review of the husbandry side. But again, I've separated the business itself into 2 basic categories. And these are what I call soft side issues and hard. And the soft ones, we will go over in greater detail, are extremely important, even though they're not things you might have to present to a bank, what have you, or a significant other in order to garner more space in the garage, what have you. But very important to identify who your buyers are, who you're going to sell to, your real cost of production. And then the hard issues, again, these are things that you might have to actually document in physical time and space and show to other people. And those are categorically a business and marketing plan. The first question you might ask yourself, or even just look in your tanks, and see what you have is what to raise. What are you going to actually sell? How to determine this? Many people know already, but for folks who are looking around or have an established business and realize they're going to have to look for new species and new specimens to raise, they'll have to develop some sort of matrix to get out and survey their potential customers and other people about what they might raise to sell. And there's a few ways to go about this. Most folks here probably belong to local clubs. Very easy to ask them what they keep, what they'd really like to keep, and always be looking. An old friend, Dick Perrin, owns Tropical Aquarium. He's been at this likewise for 40-some years. He is always looking for the next great corals to culture and sell. Also critical, determining who your customer is. I've seen this also many, many times where people think, well, I'll sell to the local hobbyist, and then, you know, I'm starting to raise a lot more organisms, or maybe I can actually pay for my hobby by selling to stores or even selling to wholesalers. It's a very critically important question to ask who your customer is and to address your efforts to them. And of course, the customer is going to be determined by a few things. I remember as a kid, I really could raise convict cichlids. I mean, I had the market hammered down, but unfortunately the market was very quickly saturated, and I couldn't sell any more convicts. But depending on how many organisms you can raise, of course, and you put on the market, you'll find the market can actually get saturated quickly, and your target price will drop in time. The real cost of production, a lot of people I know in the hobby, they have a slush fund. They have a hidden credit card. You don't have to raise your hand or look around. And the reality is you are spending more than $20 a year on supplements. Yes. And so my advice is that you become very handy with voltmeters, what have you, and figure out what your electrical cost is, the percentage of the water expense, what have you. And as I say here, very importantly, treat yourself as an employee. How many people have read The Richest Man in Babylon by George Clason? 1928 edit date. 3 ideas: get the money up front, pay yourself first, and most importantly, a part of all you earn is yours to keep. Yes, I retired from the pet fish industry from investing. So it sounds almost un-American, but the reality is everything starts with savings. And how do you save? You have to pay yourself. Now onto the hard side of developing your business. How many people have actually made a business plan? You've actually generated one. So, yes, a coincidence with the people who do aquaculture for a living. Very important. I'm perhaps very old school, though not that old, but I do strongly encourage you to generate this business plan in writing. Even if you're very handy with computers, I find there's something magical about filling out those little boxes and making sure a flow plan works. And there's certain elements to business plans. Typically, they have a time scale. Usually month to month is good. Part of the reason I like to see people developing a business plan is you can check back on it and see if it's working. And if it's not working, you just modify it. Flexibility is a hallmark of a successful species and also of a successful aquaculturist. And I must admit, this is one of my favorite things to talk about. You can probably tell from my voice, I grew up overseas. There was a Chinese philosopher, Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War. Many people have heard of them. There's a Japanese equivalent, Musashi, who wrote Go-Rin no Sho, the Book of Five Rings. And so as a kid, I wrote a business work that I thought would make me a bestseller called The 5 Critical Elements of Business. And these are categorically finance, setup, stock, personnel, and location. And as you can see, if one of them is deficient, let alone more than one, your business will not be a success. And just as an example, you can have great finances, good personnel, what have you, but if people can't find your business, you're done. First of all, and a very standard source of trouble is finance. And in fact, as the saying goes, the two principal causes of small business failure are poor management and under finance. So as the saying goes, you have to have enough money to operate the business. Very often in our field, even retail, for a year or two without any income. So starting off with enough money is very, very important. And myself, I know a lot of people here probably think you can run a GoFundMe account and run your business from it. Not likely. I'm a giant fan of what's called bootstrap financing. What does that mean? You fund it yourself. Probably not going to find venture capitalists. You know, the bank may not give you a loan. Best to start off with the most appropriate, best available technology, which is raising things at home. And a giant plug for a small business administration program called, the acronym's down there on the bottom, the Service Corps of Retired Executives. I used them a great deal when I was younger. You see some folks bobbing their heads up and down, and then years later, I am one. These are people, very often multi-millionaires, who they did what you're going to want to do, and they are very desirous of helping individuals. Give them a call. They're free. Amazing. The setup, very important. Some just standard ideas. Number one, don't buy junk. Things breaking down can be an absolute disaster, especially certain critical components. Here I showed some examples. A favorite company, Aquatic down in Florida. They still are in business, have a huge catalog. Pretty much everything you'd want to and need to use to run your business, you can order from them. And even though you may think that you're only going to be in business a year or two and don't need to be concerned about moisture, evaporation effects, what have you, a very good idea, whatever you build, wherever the physical location of your facility is, to waterproof everything. Paint and seal your stands. If there's any metal exposed, make sure that's coated. I'm a giant fan of the Celastic used for building fish tanks, for coating over nail and screw heads, for instance. A stock that you're going to sell should be pretty self-explanatory. Again, want to hit a few high points, and one is a general complaint in the trade is the size of things. So if you're going to generate a catalog or have your offerings online, a good idea to have a standard there, a ruler or what have you, next to things. The personnel, again, of those 5 critical elements can make or break you. In particular, I always strongly encourage people to gather around them and be associated. If you have business partners, what have you, even a significant other, find people that have similar values and goals, that they prize the same sort of things that you do. We used to have people come and ask us to help them, for instance, build out an aquaculture facility, and I'd look around and go, I don't see your partner. You know, they go, well, I have a silent investor. I go, no, we won't help you. We want to see a person who has a physical presence who's going to be there, because somebody's going to have to work this thing 7 days a week. There's no exception. And that person must have similar goals. Let me ask, now there's 2 of you or more. You're hungry, but it's also time to feed the livestock. What are you going to do? One person raises their hand and says, I'm out to lunch. The next one is, nah, I think it's more important to make sure the livestock gets fed. that relationship will not work. It will not. Ooh, you're smart for a young person. There we are. And again, I myself, even if you think you don't need to sleep and you'll never get bored, what have you, don't think that you're forever going to go it alone in whatever sort of size of aquaculture process you're involved in. Get a partner. Location, again, if you have a pad location, you're absolutely sunk. As James Lawrence, my publisher here in the U.S. would say, a statement without an example is hollow. So my favorite example are a couple of friends, James Fathery here and Barry Nygett, formerly of Clams Direct. Used to go to L.A., pick up tridacnid clams, put them on the internet. What you see is what you get, and sell them. Well, this photo's from the like 2005. Barry used to just get up in the morning, and he and his wife had a 2-story condo, and he'd walk downstairs in his underoos and look in his holding tanks, see what he had, and see if the pump was running, and then go make coffee and come back and check the internet to see if there are any sales, what have you. Well, something happened. I was out of the country. I came back, and he'd lost his mind and rented a space. After he told me, I said, give me the leasing agent's name and number. I'll call him up and tell him that you're my wacky uncle and you're not allowed to sign contracts. Because how are you going to do this? Now, instead of walking around in your night robe, you're going to get in your car and drive to a retail location and do everything else you might otherwise do. Anyway, it became too onerous and the business failed. So, as I say, those adverbs there, the simplest, the least expensive, and the easiest to get to, that's the location you want. And a couple of words about marketing. Everybody sells, and there are many, many forms of promotion. I cannot encourage erstwhile aquaculturists enough to have help or just themselves generate a website. It can be a very simple one. This one at the top here happens to be one that friends and I developed back in '95. But there is no less expensive, more effective advertising in the short term. In the long term, there's only your customer's experience. But in the short term, than having an effective website with good content and content that you're updating on a regular basis. Also, another plug for social networking. Some friends here on the bottom. Matt Wendell in the middle isn't here today, but the other two knuckleheads are. Laura B. Also gave a talk about aquaculture, and Richard Ross, of course, with the wacky haircut. Call on your friends to help promote your business. Yay! So are there any questions, complaints, suggestions about that brief overview of the business of aquaculture? Everybody's ready to dump their aquariums out and put guinea pigs in them? That's it? Guinea pig raceways? No. Okay. Then we'll move on to a likewise quick review of the husbandry side, the actual aquaculture itself. Why do people get involved in aquaculture? All manner of reasons. Some people have the desire to be a god. So that's it. You'll get fed when I tell you, what have you. Some folks think they're going to win the idolatry of their fellow hobbyist. Sorry about that. And believe it or not, there are some people who pay for their hobby. I met some people who actually made their house payment on a culture space of no more than 2 by 2 feet. Back in the old days of raising Bergia nudibranchs. You just had a bunch of cups that they raised them in and counted on friends to give them pest anemones for food. And then, especially if you can't help yourself from helping folks to not over-reproduce them, more humans, you may actually help save the planet by reducing the drain on the wild. More fuel to the fire. As much as you may see aquaculture specimens at your LFS and at the hobby groups, the reality is that most marines are still wild collected. In particular, in other countries, I'm always kind of shocked getting out and about. For instance, in Singapore, the people there, they still sell wild collected clownfish. Yes, they still do not live all that well being wild collected versus captive produced, but they're that much less expensive, and the turnover in hobbyists is so great that people will buy the wild caught ones and just have them die. So the majority of livestock we use is wild collected, but we can all repeat this mantra: the captive produced livestock is far superior in almost all ways. Preaching to the choir here, of course you know that there are successful aquaculturists, even people who pay their bills on the basis of what they raise. And it's not all that hard to do. I would mention to you as an academic as well as a long-standing person in the hobby that other than eating and avoiding predation, most aquatic life devotes its energies, behavior, physiology to reproduction. The organisms in your system are forever producing gametes and releasing them, growing. They can be reproduced. And quickly, I hope folks got to see Tal Sweet's talk. He mainly did a review of the history of ornamental marine aquaculture. It really is a phenomenon of the 1960s coming forward, and I'll just kind of repeat what he had said. There are some people who have chronicled the efforts of early aquaculturists, and who were they? They weren't institutions. They were hobbyists. I've even been to the International Coral Reef Symposiums and heard people talk in the last 20 years saying, wouldn't it be great if we could actually asexually fragment stony and soft corals and then do experiments with them so they'd be all the same genotype. And I'm like, hello, that's it. Hobby has been doing that. You know, you just look at the hobby literature. Oh, the hobby. And then thank goodness there are get-togethers like this now where a good deal of the hobby, business, and science are brought together. Some of the big players, I'll go through these as well very, very quickly. There are some big companies that endeavor to commercially produce marine life for the ornamental trade. Oceans, reefs, and aquariums. Pro Aquatics, I'm very glad to see, is back in business. And here, they claim they're the world's largest producer. I'm not so sure about that. And then I did add, last week they had an announcement that they were offering for sale Cuban hogfish, Bodianus pulchellus. It turns out they didn't produce them, but they do have those wrasses for sale. Some friends, I have a seahorse farm, more of a seahorse tour business now in Hawaii, the Koji Schmars. But I would tell you some of the good news. In China, there are actually a few dozen outfits that raise seahorses, not so much for the ornamental trade, but the indigenous medicine business. And they are raising nowadays millions of seahorses. And Tal didn't mention these folks, but there are some other aquaculture concerns also in other countries that have very large production. Winpeng Su and his daughter and I on this image is located in northwestern Bali. They have about 40,000 square meters of production. It was a food finfish production state-owned facility before then, and they are raising millions of fishes, including, as I have down here, and it's not a joke, Panatus batfishes, which I've lost important bets on pizza and beer bets. Yes, on people not even being able to keep them alive, and yet they have them eating flake food out of their hand, and many, many angelfishes and hybrid angelfishes in particular. And the polyglot generic statement about how many other people are involved in aquaculture. There are many, many institutions. I try to highlight because they're here. Matt Whitten-Rich, Nuri Fisher's Poma Labs, Tom Bowling and Company at Biota, Sustainable Aquatics, those concerns that are more familiar to people here in the United States. But I would tell you there are many, many hundreds and hundreds of other institutions, including just individuals that are involved in aquaculture projects. And just very, very quickly, tallied up last year that there were some 438 species of marine ornamental and non-ornamental food fish that have been successfully aquacultured to the point of adults. I think there may be closer to 500. But when I was small and cute, there were the same sorts of issues in having marine or freshwater organisms. Are there any real old-timers here from the hobby? People used to not be able to keep freshwater angelfish alive, let alone discus. And so I suspect in a not too distant future that most all marines will be able to be reproduced, but the trick of reproducing them economically may be of a longer-term challenge. So the same old clownfishes, gobies, the pseudochromids. Of course, easier to do the mouth-brooding fishes like cardinal fishes, the grammas, including actually Gramma dejongi from Cuba is now being reproduced. The more expensive fishes like marine angels. And to say it, yes, including some of the vendors here, not just fishes alone, but macroalgae, some of the more expensive marine invertebrates. The ones in the middle, I took a picture 30 years ago at Tropical Marine Center in England, but there the Debelia shrimp is now being reproduced commercially. Of course, giant clams are cultured for both food as well as aquariums. And back onto this artificial organization of ideas, how do you go about reproducing these things? It involves all these elements that are listed here. There are some others. And very quickly, I'll mention them to you. Let's say you want to grow something. Well, you can see from the hobby things like lookdowns, Selene vomer, carangids, jacks. They're not easy to reproduce, and yet they became darlings of the trade about 15 years ago when Pro Aquatics was producing them. They're not all that attractive when they're really big, sort of like me again. You know, very cute when I was small, I swear. The long and short of it is you do want to have a lookout for especially something that's brand new to the market in terms of these characteristics. It either has to be colorful markings and color-wise, or interesting behaviorally at least. Hopefully it'll live. A good example in terms of it getting along, that Steen eye, Roger Steen's pseudochromid there. Notice it looking through the side of the tank. It's just dying to kill the thing right next to it. What a beautiful animal, but what a mean SOB, as they say. So not a great animal to sell. And as I mentioned about the lookdowns, the size at which you're going to sell them, and ultimately the size the animal will get in captivity. So now you have this great idea. You're going to raise whatever you're going to raise, but it's kind of costly, and possibly it's not even available. Oh, how about those centropagi narcosis, one way or the other? You're going to have enough organisms to reproduce enough numbers in order to keep the market going. And maybe they don't mature very quickly. And it's going to take you years and years to grow them up. And if they live in a haremic condition, or even if they're in pairs, how to determine what sex they are. Of course, the very best is to buy juveniles and grow them up. The physical plant. I hope you were here for the last presentation. This, again, is a facility. They no longer raise livestock, but TMC, one of the A players actually in our trade, along with Quality Marine, Chris Berner's business, and De Jongai in the Netherlands, in my opinion. But TMC, they actually had a facility where, in order to get through it, you had to go through a disinfectant bath, wash your hands, what have you. They had a specific pathogen-free plant. That is very rare. Almost all hobbyist systems, and I would even warrant almost all public aquaria, have resident infectious and parasitic disease issues, just waiting for expression from challenges. But there are actually facilities, and maybe you'll have one, that don't actually have any potential biological disease issues. Foods, feeding, nutrition. I won't belabor this too much, but they're all three separate ideas. You'll find out that many organisms will eat most anything, but is it good for them? Is it nutritional? And you, of course, have to ascertain when the animals actually eat. Some of the early trials and people keeping corals, they couldn't understand why the organisms that did consume food didn't do so, because they were feeding during the day. And now it's known that many hermatopic corals can be trained to feed during the day, and successive generations of cultured specimens do feed more during the day. But again, the point is made that you need to determine the foods to be used, the feeding techniques, and to assure that they're nutritious. Here we go, my favorite guy, John Venn. Am I running out of time? Just tell me. I'll keep talking. The Venn diagrams, the three intersecting ovals that you see here, the way this story goes, if you can avoid one of them, you're probably okay in terms of sustaining the health, defined as the absence of disease, of your livestock. And the very best way to do that, of course, is to buy initially healthy stock, put them in a suitable environment, which is a catch-all for a zillion things, and to avoid exposure to disease-causing organisms, pathogens. And the happiest situation, as I mentioned there, in the fisheries business, we call closing the loop. And what does that mean? It's where you raise young and they in turn produce young. Once you get to that point, the organisms become much more facile, much easier to reproduce in future generations. What's this all about? Especially for sexually reproducing organisms instead of just asexually, not reproducing them by a mix of gametes. But sexually producing ones, these are the issues in fisheries. And to tell you this, fishes have a very similar endocrine system to humans, and there's an interplay the same as in ourselves and tetrapods, mammals, birds, what have you, that between the nervous system and the endocrine system. And so some of the same techniques, if you've been out to see where chickens are kept and they leave the lights on all the time, this same sort of environmental manipulation can be used to affect the endocrine system, the hormonal interplay inside your livestock, to have them produce gametes and go through the behavior of reproduction. And here they are. For instance, fishes don't have thyroids. They have chromaffin tissues. They produce some of the same sorts of chemical messengers. They do have a pituitary, and so my work, of all things, was in hormonal manipulation of mullets as an aquacultural technique, or as my mom would say, I gave fishes shots to give them the hots years ago. And so you can actually use, and what I used were mammalian extracts, PMSG, HCG, which are derived from horses, and human chorions, layering over the babies in humans. And it has a similar effect in fishes. And some of the chemicals are very simple. There's small proteins, polypeptides. You can actually use metabolites as well. But I would tell you this, you really don't need to get involved in hormonal manipulation directly. By changing the temperature, the light, even the presence of species mates, that in turn will affect the hormonal balance of your livestock. So in actual practice, people don't generally use hormonal injection directly, except for very valuable or very difficult fishes. For instance, the fishes that are used for producing caviar, paddle fishes, for instance, and acipenserids, what do people call them? Sturgeons. Those we even give intracranial injections, and the skull cavities of fishes are small, very easy to make an error. And most fishes we give intramuscular, the same as in humans, into the muscle, or intraperitoneal inside the body cavity. But as I say, by and large, these aren't used. The people in the next room over, they're not using hormonal manipulation. The fishes in particular are producing gametes almost all the time. They just employ devices for collecting, mostly the larvae, but the eggs and sperm and the larvae of the animals they are further raising. So by environmental manipulation, what do I mean? There's a myriad of factors. But again, the two that are shown here, the photo period, mainly the amount of time the light is on versus the quality or duration, and the temperature, sometimes raising it, sometimes lowering it, can be critical. And again, this is part of the mystery of determining what it's going to take to raise a given species for any given purpose. But again, if a person takes their time and is willing to go to the big college library and ask a reference librarian to show them the pertinent scientific literature, you can save a lot of time. Most all of this can be either directly read or inferred from what has actually already been written. And I would tell you again, to restate it, the animals are producing sex cells all the time. The conditions don't have to be absolutely perfect. Yeah, and sometimes the factors are additive. I should mention this, or detractive from each other. Sometimes it's a matter of doing two things at once. To mention a freshwater example, many people, freshwater people at one point, they've had clown loaches. For years and years, people always had to go back to Borneo to collect clown loaches from the wild. And even in my work with mullets, you would think mullets, come on, the things are going to reproduce. But sometimes just either it raining or pretending it's raining, lowering the water in a system and then spraying the water on the surface or rain, the recirculated water on the surface as if it were raining, or on the glass if they're in an aquarium. That would stimulate reproductive behavior. In the light I mentioned, some fishes actually have a pineal gland, the same as, it's much reduced in humans, but pretty prominent in birds. And I should mention this, somebody had, or Tal Sweet had mentioned that when Chris Turk came to San Diego in '77, he and I were out diving, and instead of breeding Garibaldi, one of the two species of damselfishes found off the California coast, We actually just went out and combed, like with a hair comb, the nests of Garibaldi males that were prominent. But in later trials, reproducing the fish in captivity, we use the same as many people utilize with Mesoamerican or neotropical cichlids, the addition of another individual, a so-called whipping boy, and that would actually bring on the behavior of reproduction. How are you going to tell when your organisms are ready to reproduce? Again, there are some visible signs, but I would tell you the very best thing, consult the literature. And if you don't know how to do it, again, reference librarians or your friends. Go to a large college library and ask for help. The reality is you probably will not have to assess the sexual readiness nor do any sort of special preparation for any given species that you can get that's in good health in order to reproduce it. It probably will be reproducing or is reproducing right now while you're here at this conference. And again, I'm sure we could all pass the Alex Trebek show if these questions came up. Most of the fishes that are kept by marine hobbyists are pelagic spawners. They release their gametes, and the gametes spend some time in the upper water column. There are a couple of families of fishes that are mouth brooders. You probably know the jawfishes and the cardinal fishes. And there's some specialty live-bearing fishes, mainly sharks and rays, and some like the tube-mouth fishes that have other peculiarities of reproduction. But most all the fishes that people keep are pelagic spawners. And there's even this possibility. There are still some outfits. Last March, I was out dive visiting in the Tuamotus in French Polynesia. There are still outfits that collect larvae from the wild, and there are some people in the aquaculture business that collect larvae or have them sent to them from other institutions. So these big public aquariums, big holding facilities, very often they have larvae that they'll give you. It can be a bit of a mess trying to sort them out, but there are ways other than reproducing the organisms yourself to get spawn. Here we go. We can't all be like Wenping Su and have a huge facility. And so there's these terms, extensive or wild culture or captive intensive culture. And all of them have their pros and cons. Probably everybody in this room, are there people from the institute, and I don't mean the madhouses, but institutions who have facilities that are thousands and thousands of square feet? Well, if not, then you're probably going to be an intensive culture person. How to figure out what to feed the animals. Again, this gets back to going to the library. Many people like myself have spent time on the ocean collecting specimens. You collect them, either give them a lavage, like lavase los manos. You wash out their guts, or sacrifice the specimens, open up their bodies and count what's inside their guts. And it gives you a very good idea of what sort of things those animals eat. And I would tell you this, I haven't emphasized it enough, the principal obstacle to raising most juvenile fishes and invertebrates is not the production of larvae, but the determination and provision of adequate food. It is. And actually, I'm very glad to hear, just from this conference, it's turning out that that issue is actually becoming not so much about what the animals might eat. For instance, you notice I have rotifer use down here. Many people are familiar with Brachionis. Nowadays, folks, many more folks are turning to several species of copepods. And it turned out, not only just 5-10 years ago, most copepods were expensive to very difficult to culture themselves as a source of food. Now the issue is becoming more of how do we reduce the cost of producing the food. And so folks are going, for instance, for culture vessels for in turn raising algae to feed copepods from different types of lighting to LEDs that might consume less electricity. So enough of that. Grow-out facilities, again, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir, and I'm afraid I'm getting close to the end of my time, so I'd like to maybe just skip ahead and ask if people have questions or comments. No questions or comments? Come on. And I'll continue. So, of course, it's the same as home aquarist. Maintenance, absolutely important. I can't tell folks enough. People here, are there any people here who use natural seawater? Even commercial people, natural seawater? You store it in the dark before it's used? You don't. You risk taker. Why aren't you out there on those games? Come on. Most all culture facilities, the same as even the largest public aquariums in the world, use what? Synthetic water. For several reasons. So it's easier to control by and large. It lasts longer, and most importantly, it's pathogen free. And so if you've gone through all the time and trouble to exclude parasites, infectious disease from your system, there certainly is no rhyme or reason to use natural water. Other than market resistance from animals being very, very small compared to the wild, let's say, I saw, for instance, at Matt Whittenrich's that they had 50-day-old conspic angels. They were still $3,000. But other than small size, some of the real issues with captive produced organisms are disease problems. In particular, as I say, genetic anomalies. It used to be a lot of clownfishes. I don't know if Martin Moe's in the audience, but in the 60s and to the late 70s, a lot of clownfish had a foreshortened upper jaw. They were kind of looked different. And now a lot of the anomalies like long finnage and what have you, people pay extra money for, thank goodness. But the genetic variances can be a big problem. I do encourage people to use cultured foods, if at all possible, versus the wild for avoiding introduction of troubles. And again, the general statements about why would you want to yourself use wild collected versus captive produced individuals. And that's it, I swear.